All right, for those of you who are absent today, we are going to do a lecture on World War I. The video you will be able to watch on your own. It's about 9 minutes, and it introduces everyone to World War I on the home front. Now, you guys already learned about World War I last year, so we're doing just kind of one big lecture going over some of the highlights of World War I in Europe, and then what was happening in the United States and the US involvement. Now, there is a note taker here in the bottom corner that you can click on, or go get and open the one in the Google Classroom. You're going to want to have two screens open so that you can watch this video on one tab and like shrink the tab or split the screen and be able to take notes on the other. Okay, so let's get started. All right, so we're just going to start with a quick overview of why, kind of 5 reasons why the United States got involved in our First World War. First was unrestricted submarine warfare, which we will see again on a different slide. This is kind of a different kind of lecture. We're going to do the ABCs of the war, so it's going to be kind of fun. So unrestricted submarine warfare, basically the sinking of the Lusitania, which was a passenger ship that held Americans on it, and the German submarines sank it. American propaganda. We are depicting the German Kaiser as a madman. Remember, we are talking about World War I, not World War II. So Hitler is a soldier. He is not the leader of Germany. We are going to be urged to ally with France and Great Britain, who are our longtime allies. We have Wilson as a president, which means he wants to make the world safe for democracy. So Avi is willing to fight a dictator. And U.S. business interests. We are very, very interested in overseas trade. And when you mobilize for a war, it increases all the things that you make and sell, so your economy increases. Then finally, the little Zimmerman note. Again, we'll see this again. Basically, Germany sent a note to Mexico, urging them to enter into the war. They were afraid that the United States was going to get involved, and so they said, hey, you guys don't have a super good relationship with the U.S., plus they've you fought wars and lost before against them, and they've taken some of your land, so what about if you join us, the Central Powers, and you attack the United States for us on the southern border. Now, before Mexico could make a decision, that note was intercepted and given to Wilson, and that is going to be the final straw. We're going to fortify our borders with Mexico and withdraw from anything that we had to do with the revolution that they were having, leave them alone, and we are going to fight Germany. All right, so here are the ABCs of World War I, the things that you need to know. So on your note taker, you will put the individual things that are in this slide deck in the right place. So is this a cause of the war? Is this about the war in theater, so in Europe? Is this an on the home front thing for the United States? Is it mobilizing for war, getting ready for war, preparing for war, supporting the war, or is it opposition to the war or reaction to the war? So there's a couple different boxes on your note taker that you will put these individual ABCs in. So for example, A. So A, we're going to talk about the Allies. So the Allies are the United States, Great Britain, France, and Russia. These are the Allied powers, and they fought the Central Powers in World War I. So in your note taker, you should probably put these in the causes, or in the war category. All right, here is a little map. Here, before the war, you will remember the Allied powers were called the Triple Entente. It's French. Entente is French. And the Central Powers, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy, they were actually the Triple Alliance. And then strangely, once the war broke out, their names changed. which seems kind of silly. But the Allied powers, the Triple Entente, becomes the Allied powers. And if you know that the Allied powers are Great Britain and France and Russia, it's really easy to remember that Entente is a French word, so it belongs to France. And so the Triple Entente becomes the Allied powers. The Central powers, literally they're in the center of Europe. Notice the big blob of orange. That is Germany and the German Empire, really, because they were still an empire. They didn't have like a president, they had a king. The Austro-Hungarian Empire. Italy was a part of their alliance, but eventually Italy kind of swapped side. They were like, hey, I think, no, we're going to go with the Allied powers. And then Bulgaria, and of course the Ottoman Empire. And remember, we went to the movies last year. Everyone saw 1917. It was cool, and that was all about World War I. All right, B. What is the B in our ABCs? That is war bonds. That is an American supporting the war thing. So on the American home front, we needed a way to pay for the war. And so the government sold war bonds. Basically, you bought this bond, gave your money to the government gave you this piece of paper, and it was a promise that if you kept this piece of paper for like 10 years, then you'd be able to give it back to the government and you'd be able to get your money back plus interest. So it's like the American people loaning the government money to go to war. So B is for bonds, war bonds, and that should go in the category of preparing for the war. And this is kind of, oh snap. It says right here, supporting the war is where you should put that. All right, back to our lecture. C, what does the C stand for? Well, Central Powers, of course. That could go in your, the in theater, the war area, or in the causes. Either way I think would be appropriate. And who are the Central Powers? That is Austria-Hungary, Germany, Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. And of course the Central Powers were going to fight the Allied powers in World War I. Another C, because that's kind of a war one, so now we have a on the home front one. C for on the home front in the United States is the Committee on Public Information. So not everyone was totally supporting World War I in the United States. We were kind of like, well, it's kind of a European problem. Like, why do we want to get involved? And as time went on and Wilson realized that we probably were going to have to step in, especially after the Zimmerman telegram, he was like, you know what, we need to sell this war to the American people. And so he created this Committee on Public Information. He hired a really prominent muckraker named George Creel to help spin the war and pump out pro-war propaganda. So the Committee on Public Education was all about spinning the war to get people to support it. So C, Committee on Public Information, and that should go in your supporting the war category. All right, D, reaction to the war, the draft. So many nations, including ours, began to conscript, that means force, citizens, or draft them to fill military positions because really almost none of the armies were quite big enough. So in America, we began to conscript, we began to draft, and a lot of people were against that. In fact, we see a former labor leader, Eugene Debs. He was the big labor guy during the Gilded Age, the socialist who wanted to kind of make America less capitalist and more socialist. And he ran for president, like from jail 3 times. He is going to publicly speak out up against the draft. He's going to pass out pamphlets and do speeches encouraging people who have been drafted to not show up to their check-in days. He's very, very outspoken against this war. He is very anti-war. We will get to it in other sides, I think, in the next one, because the next one is E for espionage. There were, as a result of Eugene Debs and other people who are super outspoken against the war, we end up with 2 laws, the Espionage and Sedition Act, that are passed in order to try to quiet the opposition to the war and basically makes speaking out against the government and against the war illegal, takes away your freedom of speech. And here it is, the Espionage Act. This is the first one that was passed. It was passed in 1917. It was a very heavy set of fines for any anti-war activity. So not just, what we think of as espionage is like spycraft, right? I'm going to break in someplace, I'm going to take pictures all sneaky, and then I'm going to send them to the enemy. So it did include that, but it also included people who were just kind of heavily anti-war, or people who were draft dodgers. All right, let's move on to F. F, Franz Ferdinand. Remember this guy? He's the one that gets assassinated by a Serbian terrorist, and he is the spark that lit the powder keg. If you had me last year, remember we drew that powder keg and put the main causes of the war, militarism, imperialism, alliances, and we put them all in a barrel, and then good old Franz Ferdinand was our spark that blew our barrel up. All right. The F, another F here, is the 4-Minute Men. These are going to be on the home front supporting the war. They were hired by George Creel for the Committee on Public Information, and these men quite literally were sent around the nation to give 4-minute speeches to advocate for the war, help to convince Americans that the war was worth fighting. All right, we are on to G. G is for gas warfare. This is the war in theater. Remember that we had lots of new, fun, deadly technology in World War I, and gas was one of them. Mustard gas and other chemical agents were tossed out into the fields, and all our soldiers had to wear gas masks. Remember that we were on the floor hiding behind our desks in trenches and listening to those firsthand stories of what it was like to watch the gas creep over the ground like octopus legs, and wondering if your mask was going to keep that gas out. All right, let's get another G. Now let's move to the home front of the United States, the Great Migration. We have, during World War I, many African Americans are going to leave the South to fill northern industrial jobs left vacant by white men going to war. We are a pretty segregated nation still. Obviously, it's worse in the South than it is in the North, but there are less black people in the North, to be honest. So there's some racism in the North that I think that maybe even white Northerners didn't realize there was so much until all these African Americans decided to move north, and all of a sudden they were like, wait a second, you're taking our jobs, and all of a sudden they felt entitled, white people felt entitled to things that they felt were inherently theirs, and it increased like racial tensions in America. African Americans did serve in World War I, absolutely, but there was less. So I know in World War II, lots more African American units were formed. In World War I, there was less African Americans than you will see in World War II. So many of African Americans, they stayed in America and they moved into industrial cities. You see the map there in green, all the different arrows, and they were really taking the jobs of the white men that had left to go to war. They settled in, certain neighborhoods. The neighborhoods become very segregated. If we look at Chicago's kind of our case study. After the war, the returning soldiers, they come in, they're expecting their jobs back, and everyone's super happy to see them. They are. Like, everyone's like, yay, we won the war. But what they find is a whole lot more African Americans in neighborhoods that had been predominantly white. And now they are competing with a whole nother group of people for a limited amount of jobs. And that's going to cause increased racial tensions in cities all across America. But we're talking about Chicago as our example. Okay, there are race riots. There will be a link in your note taker that you can explore this, the 1919 race riots of Chicago, and just scanning through. It's a very, very sparse website, gets right to the point. Kind of what was the direct cause of those riots, and then what was the lasting impact, because those race riots are going to start in 1919, but the racial tensions are going to remain very high in Chicago long into the future. And so I could say, some would argue, even still play a part today in the racial tensions in Chicago. All right, moving on to H. H is Adolf Hitler. What about him? Oh, he was a volunteer soldier who fought for Germany in World War I. He gained lots of military experience in World War I and training that would help him eventually run for chancellor and become the leader of Germany, 20 years later in World War II. All right, I is for imperialism. Imperialism is going to be a cause for the war. It's also going to be a cause for the United States to get into the war. That new imperialistic frame of mind that we need to assert ourselves into other countries' businesses. And of course, we have Wilson at the helm of our newly imperial nation, and he is all about moral diplomacy. He wants to make the world safe for democracy. And guess what? Germany is not doing that. They're not making the world safe for democracy. So of course, Wilson is going to want to step in here. So imperialism is going to be a cause for the war, because Germany is an imperial power too. And guess what? They want more land. And so they are going to be using imperialism as a motivation to spread out and expand, which will then lead to World War I. But it also is a motivation for the United States to actually get involved in the war. Another I, this is a home front supporting the war thing in the United States, the War Industries Board, the WIB. It is going to be formed by the Wilson administration to help re-look at the economy. It's going to help businesses to make wartime products. It's going to set up quotas. So if I am a business that makes, say, corsets or clothes, my company might now have a contract with the United States to make uniforms and then sell them to the US. And maybe they need 1,000 uniforms a month or 1,000 uniforms a week. And so their War Industries Board is going to set quotas for different factories to not only make their product, but to also make wartime materials. So that is the War Industries Board. Their job is to coordinate making supplies for the war. J. Let's talk about John Pershing, General John Pershing. He was a military commander during World War I. He helps to end the war. K. We can't forget about the good old Kaiser. Kaiser Wilhelm II, the leader of Germany during World War I, who started this whole mess. Well, actually, he didn't really start it. Bosnian Serbs started it, but he's definitely the one that's like, yep, we want to expand too, so might as well get on board. L. L is for the Lusitania. In 1915, the Germans had this new technology, the U-boat or the submarine, and they were just cruising around the waters, literally shooting anything that was floating. And the Germans torpedoed a British ship, because of course they're at war with Britain, and 128 Americans happened to be on that boat, and they died, which is another reason why the United States joined the war. M. Militarism. Militarism is going to be another cause for the breakout of World War I. Remember that most of European nations at the time were imperialist. They were also building up their military. Now, if the Germans are going to build up their military, well, then the British are going to look and be like, maybe we should build up our military too, just in case. And then all of a sudden, Italy looks and says, oh, maybe we should build up our military too, because then what if they attack us? And then France does the same, and then all of a sudden everyone's building up their militaries until, something happens and they end up attacking each other, which is what happens. So militarism is a cause for World War I. Another cause for World War I is nationalism. N is for nationalism. We are halfway through our alphabet here. People, Europeans in particular, have very, very strong feelings and pride and loyalty for their own countries. And as such, they want to prove that their nation is the best. And this helps to support the different countries getting into war with each other. Oh, Oliver Wendell Holmes. What is this? This is a war thing. This is a U.S. reaction to the war. That's where this belongs. He is the Supreme Court Justice that will argue that the First Amendment right to freedom of speech can be limited during wartime. So he is going to decide those cases. Those espionage cases that come before him, he's going to be like, nope, you lose. And there is one coming up when we get to S that becomes very, very important. All right, that was O. Now let's go to P. P is propaganda. Every country used propaganda. Every teacher last year would have done a propaganda lesson with you. The United States was no different. This could be, you could put this in the war category. You could put this on the U.S. supporting the war category. Either way, everyone used propaganda to get their people to support the war and to hate the other side. That was the whole point. Okay, Q. Ooh, Q is a hard one. I went searching in my brain and I came up with All Quiet on the Western Front. The book that was written, and it was one of the most famous pieces of literature that came out about World War I, about the soldiers in World War I. Great book, extra credit if you want to read it. There's films on it now too. All right. R, Q, R, S. We are in R. R is for reparations. This is a war thing, read an in-theater war thing. At the end of the war, the losing country has to pay the other countries for all the destruction they caused. These are called reparations. And Germany is going to owe so much money and is going to be in so much debt, and their country's going to go through a depression. Everyone is so poor and starving and hungry that they will end up, after 10 years, looking to a young, ambitious, nationalistic man named Adolf Hitler to try to save them from this depression that has, engulfed their country. And it will, because the Allied powers were so hell-bent on punishing Germany for their part in World War I, it ends up leading to World War II. Another R, this is a U.S. home front. U.S. citizens were asked to ration. R is for rationing. Americans were asked to go without, so the troops had stuff. So we had things like meatless Mondays, wheatless Wednesdays, gasless Sundays, and we all hate it now, the creation of daylight savings time, so that our days, the time on the clock matched like the sun in the sky, so that businesses would be able to run without using electricity because they were open like later in the day. So rationing. Americans were asked to ration. Other countries were too. Like, this was not something uniquely American. QRS. Ooh, here's the other half of that Espionage Act. The other half of the Espionage Act is the Sedition Act. The Sedition Act was passed in 1918, and it is a law that makes speaking out against the war illegal. So the espionage was just a little bit more targeted, and now the Sedition Act is super blanketed. Literally, you can't say anything bad about the government or the war, or you could get fined or put in jail. The Sedition Act. S is for sedition. Another S that goes right with that is the Schenck versus the United States Supreme Court case. So Charles Schenck, he was arrested for speaking out against the war. So he violated the Espionage and Sedition Acts. He sues the government and said, it is my First Amendment right to freedom of speech. That case makes it all the way to the Supreme Court. Guess what, people? He lost. SCOTUS, that is the Supreme Court of the United States, decided that speaking out against the war, against the government, during wartime was the same as yelling fire in a crowded theater, thus causing panic. So in their decision, they say that your First Amendment rights can be taken away if your speech creates a clear and present danger to the people around you. So speaking out against the government, telling people not to show up for their draft appointments, that is in the Supreme Court cases, in their mind, it creates a clear and present danger for the country. Agree? Disagree? You will have to tell me later. T is for trench warfare. Trench warfare is a new type of warfare. We talked about it last year, where they literally dug into the ground and built stuff down in there. That way they wouldn't get shot. And they lived in the trenches, the muddy, rat-infested trenches for months at a time. And because of those trenches, a lot of the battles ended up ending in stalemates, and there wasn't a whole lot of land lost or won by either side. U, we are almost to the end of our alphabet here, guys. U is for U-boats. U-boats were submarines. They're German submarines. And of course, Germany was attacking anything in the ocean. They were using unrestricted submarine warfare, and again, those U-boats are going to bring us, the United States, into the war. So you could put U-boats in the in-theater war section, but you could also put it in the how America or why America got involved in World War I. All right, V. We're going to have a couple V's here. V is for Victory Gardens. Okay, families were encouraged to plant victory gardens in order to feed their communities so that big farmers could sell their food to the government to send to the troops. This was also part of the propaganda campaign, trying to get regular old Americans, the men and the women and the children who were staying at home, to feel like they were fighting too, like they're supporting the war effort. Get behind the girl he left behind, join the land army. These land women, the women were left in charge of, of land, farms, of businesses. Some women got factory jobs. So women's roles begin to shift during the war. V is also for the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles, yes, that awesome palace in France. This is going to end World War I. It's going to make Germany pay all those reparations, and President Wilson is going to go there and be like, hey, maybe we shouldn't punish Germany. Maybe we should do these other things. The things that he said that he wanted to do were part of his 14-point plan. Unfortunately, the Allied powers were like, nah, we're not listening to you, but thanks for coming. Okay, QRS, TUV, W, let's get back to those women in factories. World War I, women took over some of the jobs that the men left behind. Now, when we look at World War II, literally this country was run by woman power. Like, all the men were gone. World War I, not quite as many women were pushed into the workforce, like industrial workforce, but there were quite a few. Who did fill those industrial jobs were African Americans, Mexican Americans, and other immigrants that weren't fighting. So yes, women took industrial jobs, but it wasn't quite as much as you will see in World War II. They did become part of the army. They were army, not officers, but nurses, and they did like a bunch of clerical stuff, but a lot of nurses. And they worked in ammunition plants and creating things like the masks and the uniforms and things that the men wore. Okay, our other W is double W, Woodrow Wilson. He was, of course, the U.S. president who led us into World War I. Remember that we don't actually get involved into World War I until it's almost over. We're kind of like, we plop in at the end and like save the day. Of course, why is Woodrow Wilson important to World War I? Well, he wants to keep the world safe for democracy, so fighting a dictator seemed like it fit into his diplomatic ideas. He's also going to try to end the war with his 14 points. His 14 points talks about like freedom of the seas and free trade and self-determination. All this land in Central Europe that's basically gotta go someplace because the empires that used to own it or control it are no longer going to exist because guess what? They just lost a war. So he was saying, hey, those groups should decide for themselves what kind of government they want to set up. And of course, America will be here to help them set up a democratic one if they want to. He also introduced something called the League of Nations. He wanted the leaders of all the big countries to come together and create like a council to help prevent future wars. The League of Nations doesn't exist today, but the United Nations does. And so the League of Nations is kind of the infant that becomes the United Nations of today. X was hard to find, X too. So I did X is the fixed wing airplanes. Airplanes were another new technology used in World War I, mostly used for reconnaissance, but definitely towards the end they got in some dogfights. But World War II, you see them used much, much, much more. But yeah, so the first dogfights, have you ever seen like the Charlie Brown with Snoopy and the, I want to call it the Red Bandit. It's not the right thing. But yeah, so reconnaissance and a little bit of dogfighting towards the end. And why? How about I want you for the U.S. Army? This super iconic military recruitment poster is created during World War I to get people to recruit. And of course, the U.S. is going to enter that war with a bunch of fresh, young, there's another Y, troops to help turn the tide in the favor of the Allies and win the war. And the last one here, the Zimmermann telegram. Germany sent Mexico that offer to join the war, which infuriated Americans and convinced the U.S. to enter the war on the side of the Allies. Poor choice on Germany's part because they end up losing. All right, that's it for the ABCs of World War I, y'all. Now, the last thing that you have to do is do a little, it's not really a DBQ, it's a little mini Q, talking about forming an opinion on whether or not your freedom of speech should be able to be limited during wartime. Think about that. All right, see you later, guys.